I'm going to go into share the screen. If you want to put those on, because you're going to be
okay.
Share this because you won't see any of this anymore in a second, I'm afraid. It's for whatever reason.
All right, we're live.
Okay. So you're ready to go.
That's good. Okay.
You guys look great.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm sorry it's a little late. We've had a series of unfortunate events, but glad to be online. This is an episode of Stand 2020 as part of our No Apologies group. Myself, Steve Hawken, Phil Chambers, seek to investigate some of the objections to the gospel, and we will delve into various aspects of them and open them up for discussion. The idea is to generate more light than heat, and to be able to present certainly objections in their true light, and present the gospel in its beauty and purity. I'm going to be dealing with a topic called creation evolution. It's impossible to cover in complete detail, but what I did think of doing is providing 6 fundamental questions which I think need to be addressed if we're going to be talking about the origins of the universe as we see it, and life as we see it. These are the observations we see around us, and to them we must draw conclusions as to how did it come to be, where did it come from, was it created, did it emerge out of nothing, and if it is created, is there a creator, and who or what is that creator, and what's our relationship with them. So I have 6 questions, and I think we're going to spend a little while on each. This will last no longer than an hour, and I do want to apologize for the late start. The first is the concept of everything we see and experience around us had to come from somewhere. We exist in a time-space continuum, and there's little doubt that what we see and experience is not an illusion, and therefore, where did it come from? So the first question is it possible that everything that we see around us could have come from nothing? Nothing at all. This is a quote from one of our commentators saying, "We are nothing less than nothing. Our lives are meaningless. We came from nothing and we will return to it. There's no God, only the void, and I'm okay with that." That's certainly an opinion, but it's not an opinion shared by the vast majority of mankind in the broad sense. If we came from nothing, there'd have to be some evidence that anything can emerge from nothing. It seems to be an obvious and logical question. What's the definition of nothing? Some did it as things that rocks dream about. But nothing by definition is no measurable entity by any stretch of scientific imagination. It cannot be weighed, it cannot be observed, it cannot be felt, it cannot be touched, it cannot be measured. In other words, no thing. Yet the universe around us actually is measurable, observable, touchable, smellable, tastable, and therefore, by definition, it does exist and is a thing. So do things come from out of thin air, out of nothing? This is not our experience. However, some mental athletics has been used by philosophers such as Lawrence Krauss, who has produced a book called A Universe from Nothing, Why There's Something Rather Than Nothing. The afterword is by Richard Dawkins. Something from nothing might well have been accurately described if he had provided a foreword of a book that came from nothing. It would have to be nothing itself, so it could only be an afterword, which is, I guess, the only way he could have commented on this commentary. Lawrence Krauss is a celebrated atheist, but again, it begs the question, is there any evidence at all that things emerge out of nothing? Magicians claim to conjure things out of nothing, but all magicians know in their heart of hearts that it's a sleight of hand and a trick. Therefore, they know that in reality, the things that they are producing seemingly out of nothing actually come from somewhere else. It is not our experience that matter, energy, or anything that's measurable suddenly emerges with no prior evidence of existence. It is simply not our experience. Dr. William Lane Craig, who's a philosopher of note, has invoked what he calls the Kalam cosmological argument. It is our communal experience that whatever begins to exist has a cause. And we know that the universe in which we exist certainly began somewhere. It is not an eternal event. It simply pushes the existence of the universe further back in time to a point when it had to have started. And because it has a cause, it has to then have a source of existence. We've known this for a long time. The cause outside nature implies something extra-natural, or could we venture to say supernatural, an agent. And an agent that has capacity to cause the universe as we see it to come into existence, given the nature and design and balance of elements of this nature, it certainly begs an intelligence. Randomness is so unlikely to produce the order and complexity we see, it can be written off as a creator of the universe as we see it. Our very definition of randomness is directionless, purposeless, and uncontrolled. And the universe is neither directionless, purposeless, or uncontrolled. So for thousands of years, atheists have attacked the fact that the universe has begun to exist, but now I think there's strong evidence that there was a beginning. The next slide shows you a pictorial demonstration of what we could refer to as the Big Bang theory. Intriguingly, there had to be a start. There was sudden, what are referred to as quantum fluctuations, and then an expansion of the universe we observe at the moment, which is in motion and traveling around us as we see the motion and the structure of the universe we're observing like we've never done before. This implies the universe exists and had a beginning. Estimates have been in the billions of years, although that certainly is under debate, and we may tackle that separately. But the important thing is that it had a beginning, and if it had a beginning and it had a cause, there must have been a causative factor. Whether one refers to it as God or something else, one has to invoke a cause, which is a fundamental plank on which creationist arguments rest. A little bit further exploring this, the logical premises of 1 and 2 are that the universe has a cause, and because the universe didn't create itself, something outside it must have brought it into being. It must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, and indeed must have power in order to speak the existence of what we see into being. Now, the power to bring things into existence from nothing is indeed creative power. And that spaceless and timeless, immaterial, powerful and personal cause of the universe is what mankind has known for years in various levels of complexity, the entity God. Intriguingly, this is well known. As early as the 1950s and 60s, and even long before, the two possibilities show how life arose, or how creation actually, or the universe existed, is spontaneous generation, and the process of the complexity of what we see around us pointing to evolution, either was guided by an act of God, or it arose as an act of randomness. There's no third possibility. It's important to realize this. Spontaneous generation, that life arose from non-living matter, was scientifically disproved many years ago. And it leaves us with the only possible conclusion that life and the universe arose as a supernatural creative act of God. But here, in the words of admission of George Wilder, professor of biology, I don't want to believe in God. I will not accept it philosophically because it's not my desire to believe in God. So I choose to believe in that what I know is scientifically impossible, spontaneous generation, rising to evolution. So an a priori commitment to edit God out of his creation. Second question is, creation around us appears to operate particularly well with physical laws of the universe. These are observations that we have been making through the centuries and millennia, that there is a predictability about how the universe actually works. Various individuals' names have been assigned to the constants which have been identified, and you can see them in this. There is a Planck constant, there is Higgs vacuum expectation, there's a Yukawa couplings, etc. All of these are observed measurements, dependable and unchangeable observations of how matter and energy interact in the universe. These are predictable. And all of them have got calculations, all based on astute and careful observation by scientists. We must have these constants, and they're observed because they're constant. And it suggests that they reflect order and precision. The interrelated nature of these constants provides some predictability, which, as you know, is hardly a byproduct of a randomness by definition. Even subatomic physics, although sometimes difficult to understand, is still governed by laws. Our understanding in our current human interaction is that laws are made by people. Laws are not made by inanimate objects. And the fact that we make laws indicates that something similar to our nature makes laws as well. The laws of the universe don't just happen by accident, but they are designed and carefully prescribed, just like the laws we make to accomplish various social actions. The wave and particle theory and quantum behavior are all observations that appear to be predictable, and in fact we rely on these observations to make scientific advances. So the events, oddly enough, at the so-called Big Bang are widely spoken about as having deviated from observable physics. Now, if these physical constants have been observed to be reliable, how is it possible that at a time when the universe started, the laws that governed the distribution of material and matter suddenly, for some reason, didn't obey those constants and obeyed some other laws? It can only be speculation. And scientists now who hold fast to the theory of the Big Bang just say that things had to have happened like that in order to get what we see and observe now. It certainly is a step of faith because they can't describe the laws and they're unable to account for why they would have changed from the time that the Big Bang occurred to what we observe currently. So physical laws are predictable observations by humans to humans. And it's absolutely certain in the scientific, philosophical community, even if it's atheistic or theistic, we know that without these dependable laws, life is actually impossible. So the physical constants do suggest that there is planning and design so that the universe will work well so that we can exist in it. This currently is the biggest building on Earth. It's in China, and you can see that it has symmetry and structure and purpose. No one in their right mind would consider that something of this nature came into being by randomness. It certainly has design, it has intelligence behind it, it has form, it has function, it has usefulness, and obviously this vast structure being put together by humans somewhere on this planet represents the product of an intelligent mind. How is it possible then, when we see the intricacies of creation, that we assign the architect to chance alone, and that there's no intelligent design behind the exquisite detail we see around us? The third issue is, what about astrobiology? This is the study of finding out why or how life can exist in the universe at large. A definition of it is a study of investigating the origin or evolution, distribution, future of life on Earth, and also search for life beyond the Earth. It addresses the fundamental questions of how does life begin and evolve, and you will see the enormous amount of interest in pronouncements from entities like NASA that it appears moisture is found on the surface of Mars, or ice is present on the surface of the Moon, all of which attempt to offer an explanation as to what are the building blocks of life, and is it possible they could have been elsewhere, not just here on our privileged planet? Second question is there life beyond Earth, and would there be a way of detecting it if it existed? And then lastly, a futuristic view of it. What is the future of life on Earth, and indeed in the universe at large? So very large questions, very important ones, if one's got to understand why life exists here at all, and could it exist anywhere else? So there have been ways of looking at what makes planets habitable. We appear to be in what's referred to as a Goldilocks zone. Goldilocks, of course, is a fairy tale of a young girl lost in a forest, comes across a house owned by bears, and there are three bears: mum bear, daddy bear, and baby bear. And the various places and beds and table, chairs, and settings are all assigned a certain characteristic that would fit mama, baby, or daddy bear. And mama bear seems to be right in the middle and just right. You can see right in the middle here in this picture where the habitable zone is, where Earth is. It's placed in a position where it's not too hot, its size is perfect, it's near a local star, it has an orbit, it's got a moon, and there are a number of characteristics, the further and deeper we look at the Earth, that enables it to be a perfect place where life as we know it and can see exists. Our moon is the right size and distance from the Earth. Our moon's gravity stabilizes the Earth's rotation. Our position in the galaxy is perfect to be able to observe outside our galaxy, beyond the Sagittarian arm of Andromeda, the nebula we're in, so that we can observe the rest of the universe around it. If we were any close to a star-dense part of it, we wouldn't be able to see out. And if we were any further away, we wouldn't be able to enjoy any of the positional benefits of being in the nebula we're in. Our atmosphere is clear, so we can see through it, but it is dense enough with the gases that enable us to survive. And you can see that there are an enormous number of physical characteristics which make our planet perfect for the life that we currently exist and are even able to observe. It indeed is a privileged planet. This is one of the most famous photographs taken from one of the Apollo missions, coming over the surface of the moon and observing Earth with the reflected sunlight off it, the blue planet. Its composition of chemicals and elements, its atmosphere with just the right balance of gases, its temperature working between a habitable temperature, certainly hot in certain places, too hot in Australian desert, too cold in the Antarctica, but the populations are thin in those areas. The population is larger in more temperate climates. The internal dynamics of the Earth, the intricate cycles that are absolutely essential, carbon cycle, oxygen cycle, nitrogen, phosphorus, all of these are cycles with elements in perfect proportions in order to sustain life. For this to have occurred by accident is so laughable that the astronomical chance of it occurring purely by random is estimated by mathematicians to be of the order of 10 to the power of 140. Now, estimated number of atoms in the entire universe is around about 10 to the power of 80. So we are looking at astronomically impossible possibilities of this coming together purely by random. It would be like winning the Powerball 5,000 times in a row. You would think that there was some cheating going on if somebody won the Powerball 5 times in a row. This is the Drake equation, which has been used to attempt to quantify the chance of finding life elsewhere in the universe that we can see. It's estimated on an assumption that technologically advanced civilizations somewhere in the Milky Way galaxy, and there are more galaxies than that, the rate of star formation, the fraction of the stars that have got planets, the number of planets with an environment suitable for life in a Goldilocks zone, the fraction on which life actually appears, the fraction of life bearing in which intelligent life appears, and that begs the question of how we would define intelligence. Those that develop technologies that release detectable messages to send to us, and then the length of time they release detectable signals into space. We haven't found one yet, but the possibilities of finding one appear to be infinitesimally small. As we know, the uniqueness of the Earth and the difference from other planets make it easy for us to even think about technology, about signals sent from other intelligent life, about intelligence itself. So all of these are definitions that we make up ourselves on this planet when we're trying to look for people like us. Even further, the fine-tuning of the universe for human life is too impossible to have imagined it arriving by chance. Gravitational forces are perfect for life to exist. Distance from the sun, the right heat, expansion of the universe appears to be just right for life. The existence of Jupiter as a giant cosmic vacuum sucking up stray asteroids keeps them from flying around randomly in our particular solar system. The thickness of the Earth's crust, which is correct for the amount for life. The tilt of the Earth enables seasonal variations. The speed of light is a proper amount for life. We rely heavily on it. Strong nuclear forces that hold the atoms together is critical for molecular integrity. The distance between even the stars that we see around us create gravitational and magnetic forces in the universe which keep our solar system stable. The cosmological constant is minutely right for matter to exist and not vaporize and become energy. The right amount of seismic activity on the Earth is needed for life, etc. There are hundreds and hundreds of these observed, fine-tuned constants and realities that all of us rely on, and most of us are not even cognizant of. So it looks as if a super intellect lies behind this fine, precise, law-driven universe. And the reason is because there actually is a super intellect behind it all. The satisfying answers to why the universe works so well and why our planet and our Earth is so perfect for life's existence is because there is an intelligence fine-tuning it for us to even think about these things. Just like a fine-tuned automobile demands a tuner, or even a piano demands a tuner for a perfect tune, so our fine-tuned universe demands a designer. Nothing makes sense if an ultimate tuner doesn't exist, but really everything does make sense if he does. And the biblical account, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, puts God's stamp of authority and creative genius on to the universe we observe. He ordained the moon and stars, the heavens are the work of his fingers. They declare his glory. He upholds all things by the power of his word. And the infinite eternal creator is before all things, in other words, before the, quote, Big Bang. And in him, all things consist. So he sustains it by his word. This is talking about power. And he tunes it for his purposes. And we are privileged to exist in it. And you might ask, why and what for? That would be for another discussion. Let's look at the emergence of life in this beautiful, fine-tuned and perfectly designed universe. How did life exist? Well, become to exist? Well, various opinions have been sought, and various scientists have sought to find ways to imagine how chance might have put the components of life together from non-living matter. Well, proponents of evolution have suggested that from the Big Bang, the universe and our solar system, and then ultimately our Earth, were initially a lifeless structure floating in a meaningless void. But how is it possible then, as we look around us, we see the variety of life and living material? Abiogenesis is the idea that life actually came from non-living material, and it's sometimes called spontaneous generation. The environment of the early Earth might have provided a very unique set of conditions that allowed life from non-life to occur. Researchers now believe that an early atmosphere, of course, had to be similar to the vapors given off by modern volcanoes. A recent event at White Island revealed just how violent volcanic life can be. It destroyed some tourists coming from a cruise ship and had made worldwide headlines. So toxic gases and material emerging from a vent in an aperture in the Earth's surface where tectonic plates open certainly does not necessarily produce healthy environments for life to begin. In fact, more likely than not, it would extinguish life. But these vapors, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen, all emerge from these vents. Intriguingly, not much atmospheric oxygen comes from these events, and all of us know that oxygen is absolutely critical to the emergence and sustenance of living material. So, how did life appear from inorganic material to what we see around us? There are 7 major challenges for the chemist. There has to be an origin and a source of the elements themselves. This is very easily and slyly glossed over by chemists and biologists. You do need to have the formation of atomic material. You need to have protons and neutrons. They have to be held together by interatomic forces, and they have to be balanced electronically by an appropriate number of electrons swirling around the atoms to give the atom its nature. Where did these atoms come from? What were the original protons and neutrons? Where did they arise? How did they suddenly explode in a universe that did not operate according to the laws of physics we see around us? How is it possible these elements all formed in perfect ratios to give us the complex structures we see around us with no debris, with no half-hearted random attempts to form molecules that can't exist on their own, that do not have any place or space in the universe we see? Why are there no spare parts of bits of materials floating around that do not appear to be of any use? We don't see these. So that certainly is a challenge. The origin and source of small molecule precursors is equally mysterious. The origin and source of monomers, clumps of what we would regard as functional molecules. Every molecule we discover, every one, has some sort of part to play in the mechanism of the universe around it. None of it appears to be of no use. What about the condensation problem? It's thought that massive amounts of heat and light and high amounts of radioactive energy and so on were all responsible at the beginning of the so-called Big Bang to flood the space of the universe with debris and material. This suddenly had to coalesce into the planets that we see formed today. How is it possible that they would have coalesced into the usable and functional forms we see around us in our own solar system and indeed our globe? This does not appear to be easy to explain. The self-replication problem, of course, is elements in our created world we see around us on a regular basis have the capacity to replicate. How is that possible? How does the capacity to replicate be discovered by pure chance? It appears to be designed, and I'll come to this later. The chirality, or the position of the molecules in a usable form, is most notable. I've done biochemistry as one of my undergraduate degrees, and when we were synthesizing amino acids, we recognized that there were different forms of exactly the same chemical makeup that would emerge from the broth that we were cooking. What we see in nature, however, is one form of those molecules repeatedly identified. But when we're cooking them up in a laboratory, we see an equal mixture of both forms. And it's hard to imagine then that when we are building them with design and in a natural setting, we would have two forms, whereas in the universe around us, we only see one, which certainly points to a careful design. And then the compartmentalization problem of molecules of life being confined to an area where they can work shielded from the outside forces of chemical damage, as we see in cell walls. These are considerable problems and need to be explained. However, the explanations run like this. Monomers diffuse into fatty vesicles, but there's no known origin of fatty vesicles. They spontaneously polymerize and copy any template. Again, it's an assumption, but cannot be proven. Heat separates strands, and one has to ask where strands came from. Increases membrane permeability. How is that possible? Too much heat will destroy them. Too little heat won't do the trick. The polymer backbones attract ions, increasing osmotic pressure. That's hard to prove. Pressure on the membrane drives growth, which is again very hard to prove. It might work with bubbles, but not with living organisms. Vesicles grow into tubular structures. Again, that has to happen for tubes to form, but there's no mechanism postulated. Mechanical forces cause them to divide. Well, why don't mechanical forces cause them to disrupt? Daughter vesicles inherit polymers from the parent vesicle. Obviously, there's no proof of that. And polymer sequences replicate faster. How do they replicate? We'll come to that in a moment. These are vast steps of evolutionary assumption, which have little proof behind them. Even the earliest experiments of complex molecules forming in science have come under increased scrutiny. This is a diagrammatic representation of the famous Miller-Urey experiments, which were done in the 50s and 60s. Groups have already formed building blocks for organic material were put into an atmosphere, there were sparks, and then a solution was collected, and odd organic molecules appeared after a few days. Bear in mind, this was a constructed experiment. It wasn't random at all. Oddly enough, the organic molecules were completely not useful. They couldn't be replicated or couldn't be produced in large enough quantities to survive heating and cooling. And unless they're built in with a lot of other machinery, they would have no purpose on their own. Like a spanner lying at the side of the road is of no use whatsoever unless there's a nut or a bolt that it can twist. So how did modern life arise? This is the sequence of events that our children are being taught. Chemical evolution, we're not quite sure, but we've got some ideas. Self-organization, again, we've got some complicated ways of doing this, but we don't really have certainty. And then, voila, biological evolution and evolutionary theory. And this is trotted out moment by moment, day by day in schools all over the country about the origin and evolutionary history of life on Earth. But let's look a little more closely at the real science behind this. I shall come to this at a recent paper that was published in Geoscience Frontiers in July 2018. And it's a research paper which pulls together all of the current knowledge about how mechanisms which could potentially be estimated or measured, turning inorganic molecules into living cells and structures. The highlights of our review includes the whole stage of chemical evolution of life. This is certainly a bold claim, and the geochemical and geological settings favorable for life's origin are proposed. So you would think that these two Japanese researchers are really putting their finger on the plausible origins of life. Kitadai and Maruyama are setting out to lay the foundations of a plausible mechanism for life to exist. And diagrammatically, this is busy, but have a look at the 5 particular headings at the top, which suggest that there were inorganic molecules. I would draw your attention to the fact that these inorganic molecules, firstly, one has to have a plausible mechanism of how they came to being, and that's not tackled. However, they start with the inorganic molecules, then they move to organic precursor molecules, and then they go to building blocks, which are the molecules that we observe around us that are vital for life and living mechanisms. Then they go to what are called functional polymers, or more complex molecules, such as DNA and RNA, and then postulate that cellular formation may occur. It does look impressive. They do invoke chemical processes, but we do have to look quite carefully at how one is to get from the left-hand side of the page to the right-hand side of the page with undirected processes. And this is where the devil is in the details. They will say, taken together, the current scientific knowledge denies the possibility that primitive molecules provided amino acids in sufficient concentrations to support chemical evolution of life. This is a powerful refutation of their own postulates. If all of the observed information that we see around us in the world and in science denies the possibility that these building blocks for amino acids that were not in sufficient concentration to support the chemical evolution of life, that would render their hypothesis falsifiable. Just that statement alone. Because if there is any one breakdown in this proposed mechanism, the entire mechanism falls to pieces. The second, it is a statement that they too make. It's unclear how amino acids were accumulated and purified in such extreme environments at the beginning of the world. So therefore, there's no plausible scenario that can explain all the stages of the origin of life. Read it again. No plausible scenario. In other words, science not only is unable to find a rational pathway from molecules to, at least inorganic atoms to molecules to life, but there's no plausible scenario that can explain. The next one, there's no single setting can offer enough chemical and physical diversity for life to originate. That again is a tacit admission that doesn't appear to be the right environment that they can even think about or construct that would enable this chemical evolution to occur. And lastly, the most complex of molecules, RNA and DNA, postulate a continuous and ample supply of activated molecules, monomers from surrounding environments, and their occurrences in large amounts on a primitive Earth are unlikely. So they're the very building blocks of life in the form of DNA and RNA. They're implausible to have existed at all, by their own admission. These four statements taken together would put the death knell into the theory of chemistry to molecules to life. This is an evaluation of current scientific knowledge. So we've discussed that one of the problems that they have is that they've got no good answers to how life started originally. And now we've got good answers to that it didn't start originally because the mechanisms by which it was supposed to have started didn't exist. And even science itself admits it. So let's say that somehow something snuck through and all of the unlikelihoods lined up to possibly produce the life we exist by chance. This statement would put the death knell, the nail in the coffin for the theory. To produce a functional protein fold in one sequence of DNA, just one, it would require unguided Darwinian processes, but in doing so would require the chance to be calculated as if you closed your eyes and you shot an arrow into the Milky Way and you hit at one pre-selected atom. To be honest, you'd need a tremendous amount of faith to be able to imagine that life evolved by chance, let alone one functional protein change. We'll further press on. In every single cell of your body that you're using to listen to me now, you have a process that's going on billions of times a second. You're using sugar to be broken down and in the process produce ATP, which keeps your cells alive. In order to do this, you need lots of little enzymatic processes to chip away at the sugar and in doing so be able to chemically produce the energy to keep a cell together. Every single one of these steps requires a complicated piece of molecular machinery in just the right concentration, in just the right environment, in just the right pH, in just the right temperature. That's in order to produce ATP, which is a battery that keeps every cell working. Each of these, oddly enough, requires ATP to run. So it's like having a car that produces the fuel that it uses to produce fuel. Like drinking water. It's yes. Thank you, Steve. So you can see how impossible it is for a cell to evolve these things because it requires the very components to produce the energy to keep it going. And in order to produce its components, it needs the energy first. Not only that, but there are complicated enzymatic processes needed inside mitochondria in order to produce this energy too. The complexity is mind-boggling, and discovering the detail points to a designer, a brilliant designer, a genius, an intellect far above what we can see. And in the words of Blaise Pascal, science should be thinking God's thoughts after him. We see how he did things, we see this biochemical milieu, we marvel at it, but we do not credit the artist and the creator. Mitochondria, which take on these little molecules and further metabolize them and make energy molecules, are equally complex and difficult to imagine how they could come into being without a designer. Even more difficult is the nucleic acid buildup or makeup of genetic material. These nucleic acids, 4 types of which we know, have to string themselves together with a sugar backbone in order to present a code. And the code is an intelligent code. The code has a fascinating decoding mechanism which carries the information required to build every single structure in the cell. And this begs a question. If DNA has a code and needs to be unwrapped by molecular hands like DNA polymerase you can see in front, you have to start with DNA polymerase in order to unwrap the code. But in fact, the nucleic acid sequence in DNA has to code for that very protein itself, so which came first. You can see this code beautifully described in this diagram. There are 4 types of nucleic acids, and various sequence of triplets of them code for the amino acids you can see around the outside of the circle. And these are the building blocks of proteins. The sequence of nucleic acids are the building blocks of the information library from which we build proteins. And this is a schematic diagram of a very complex protein that is produced in the billions and stuck to the little mitochondria, which are responsible for producing energy for every single cell in your body. So we come to the end of Kitadai and Maruyama's article, 57 pages long. And he says, they both say at the end, most seriously, the overview might not represent prebiotic processes that actually occurred on the primitive Earth. Rather, it was depicted based on the current scientific knowledge of the origin of life. But staggeringly, they come to the concluding remarks. Now we could figure out the geochemical inventory necessary to drive all stages of chemical evolution, ranging from nutrient acquisition, organic synthesis, accumulation, polymerization, and their interactions. That is breathtaking in its hope. The other 4 statements that I alluded to in our previous slide indicated that it was impossible under current knowledge to provide a rational explanation for how we got from atoms to molecules. So really, it's speculation. The depth of scientific knowledge does not in any way explain the diversity of biochemical material. And there are a couple of other unpleasant realities. Water is necessary for life, all of us know this, but if you dissolve a lot of these chemicals in water, unfortunately, biomolecules and nucleotides simply don't form. They split up. And evolutionists speculate that another type of clear liquid called formamide was used as a solvent in the primordial soup, but they're not found in nature. So if they aren't found now, how can you speculate that they were found in aeons gone by? The oxygen-rich atmosphere that we see around us actually is quite toxic to a lot of biochemical processes. So it wouldn't form biomolecules. So we are really at a loss evolutionarily to explain the origin of life in the universe. And in fact, what we observe is that it was much more likely created than could have formed by chance. In fact, science tends to support a creationist view rather than a gradual formation of abiogenesis. This is the last slide in this particular group. Not only have we looked at the impossibility of these complex molecules forming from inorganic atoms, but the biochemical world and the genetic world becomes even more complex. And all the processes guiding this complexity by chance now become so astronomical as to be impossible. So the odds of complex life evolving by random chance are impossibly small, but the best the atheist can come up with is that if you read a science book instead of the Bible, you'd know that evolution involves the operation of non-random physical laws upon random events, which is not the same as random by blind chance. This is neither common sense, and if it's atheistic, it certainly is nonsense. Let's have a little quick look at Cambrian explosion and fossils. This is a little blurry, I'm sorry, but we'll look at the evolution narrative. The universe emerged 13.7 billion years ago, apparently. The first forms of cellular life were 4.5 billion years. All species are descended from common ancestors and find their origin in a single-celled organism. That's a big statement. Species changed over time through mutations. First humans evolved from chimp-like apes, and Homo sapiens dated 200,000 years ago. That's the evolution narrative. And we can see that drivers of evolution are small populations, mutations, flows of genes, natural and sexual selection, apparently. It's difficult to imagine how a female and a male from the same species could have evolved simultaneously in the same place with the capacity to procreate, to produce the diversity of life we see. Today's species descended from more ancient forms, and this is a tenet they have to hold on to. So this is the postulated timeline of evolution, from the formation of the Earth, they say, through until this present day. Now, I want you to follow what we have gone through from the lower left part of the graph, from the oldest known rocks, they're already formed inorganic molecules, through to prokaryotic fossils, which imply that there has been the molecules to living material abiogenesis, which in the previous question we answered really is improbable. However, it then assumes that we go through to an accumulation of oxygen, eukaryotic fossils, and then multicellular animals, and then what's called the Cambrian explosion. And there was a sudden major diversification of an event, appearance of many modern animal phyla and fossils. How did this all suddenly, spontaneously happen? Here it is. That is the explosion of life that's assumed. And we have to ask ourselves, how is it possible that the capacity to reproduce suddenly arrived? There had to be a chicken or an egg. Which came first? The fully formed animals, which had the ability to procreate, or was there an egg that enabled them to then be born and fully grow? This Cambrian explosion appears in evolutionary explanation to be evidence in the fossil record that major phyla were established in the transition from late Precambrian to early Precambrian time, billions of years. In the creationist model, the animals represent descendants of the original created kinds that became extinct during the flood of Genesis. But evolutionists have to say that they have no real possible explanation for the sudden appearance of so many types of life instantly. Bear in mind, the narrative is that it came from one living ancestor and suddenly and slowly, at least randomly and slowly, accumulated complexity and gave us the diversity of life we see. This is the explanation given, but it's very puzzling as to why there are little or no precursor fossils to these massive varieties of life, and propose a headache for the evolutionist. And here, the chair of evolution at Sorbonne University in Paris, naturalists have got to remember that the process of evolution is revealed only through fossils, and a knowledge of paleontology is therefore a prerequisite, and it can provide them with evidence and reveal its source of mechanisms. So we have to see a progression of life forms from their earliest precursors to the complexity we see now. That is going to have to be a plank on which evolutionists stand to justify their theory. And the fossil record is touted as solid proof that the theory of evolution is true, while creation and the flood are false. But when one examines the evidence, the opposite is found to be the case. The three major traits that characterize a fossil record: abrupt appearances of complex organisms, no development or diversification of these organisms, and then ultimately the death of many of the organisms, extinction, they contradict the evolutionary predictions and, more likely than not, provide support for creation and flood predictions. So the fossil record, unfortunately, is summarized as there are major missing links between different types of organisms. We don't find them. We've got one that is apparently primitive, and then we've got a complex one down the track, but nothing in between. And that does not suggest a gradual Darwinian type evolution. There are different types of living fossils that are supposed to have died out that we exist, like the coelacanth, or like various snails and various fish. There's a sudden appearance of fully formed fossils in the Cambrian explosion. So there's no evidence of preformed halfway house type staggered elements, organisms. The same kinds that we see in the Precambrian fossil record exist today. Trilobites, various types of sea creatures, and some species are of course extinct. We know they're wiped out, but no new kinds evolved, no new types of animal genres. And it seems to support the creation model. And if the theory of evolution were true, as proposed, there are millions of chimps, of course, and there's lots of people, but how come there's not many intermediate forms? Over the last 150 years since Darwin proposed the theory of evolution, there have been an enormous number of fossil specimens collected. And Darwin said that evolution happened so slowly we couldn't really see it. It was a very gradual approach. Gould, Stephen Jay Gould from New York, he said that it happened too quickly for us to see it. But either way, we actually don't see the intermediate forms, and this presents a headache for our evolutionary colleagues. So the reasonable extrapolations from this vast collection of fossil data are that if something of major significance was actually there, I'm sure we would have seen it. And evolutionist change over time appears to be, should be abundantly confirmed, but we don't see any similarity in it. A more detailed look shows that the fossil record actually is more of a problem for evolutionists than something that confirms their assumptions. And here, for example, is a find of a fossilized fish eating another fossilized fish. This had to have occurred instantly, surely. The narrative of how fossils formed will come to in a moment. And there are such glaring gaps in the fossil graveyard, places where there should be intermediate forms, but where there's nothing at all, and no paleontologist denies this. So it's simply a fact that Darwin's theory and the fossil record are in conflict, and this from David Belinsky, a mathematician who is an atheist. So how do you become a fossil? Well, you can avoid the carnivores who don't die when you before you get eaten. You avoid the scavengers after you die. It's difficult because you're already dead, and scavengers will eat things that are already dead. You've got to be buried very deeply, because all sorts of decompositions will occur if you die in an area where fungi and bacteria can feed on your carcass. And it's got to make fast work of you if you're only covered by a foot or two of mud. And we don't see fossilization occurring with the billions of animals and creatures that die around us. If you're buried deeply, you have a problem. There are so-called anaerobic decompositors, which can eat up your body. And you've got to be very quickly buried, because the conditions have to be right for the conversion of your organic material into stone, formation of rock through water and certain chemicals and very high pressure. So this is how to become a fossil. Then you've got to also get up to the surface quickly in order to be discovered before you get eroded away, and that's why we can see these fossils. So you can't just die and fall down and become a fossil. So there should be billions and billions of fossils, right? There shouldn't be billions of fossils, because most living organisms that were sank and died and were supposed to have sunk into fossilized rock, they should have decomposed long before they became fossils. But they're abundant in the earth, so we have to have an explanation as to how they arrived. And we date, as creationists, will date the flood to about 5,000 years ago. They required geological features that we see around us require catastrophic explanation. Sedimentary rock formations cover continent-sized regions. So it's a huge global event that must have occurred. Large coal, oil, and iron ore deposits are present, and they're not forming as we speak today. So they must have been formed at a cataclysmic event. Intriguingly enough, if you look at oil, iron ore, and gas deposits, they are usable materials for our life on Earth. And one wonders that a designer who created the Earth would have designed a source of energy for us to tap in aeons into the future. Mountains are made of ocean bottom rocks. Ocean fossils on continent and interior mountains, and fossils of warm habitat plains are seen near the poles of the Earth. And there are lots of exceptions to standard geological columns. There are strata that seem to be out of order with others, and different age fossils altogether. All of these point to a cataclysmic event, which suggests that the fossils were laid down at one time in a universal, or rather a global event that would suggest a flood. And if we look at Colin Pattinson, a senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History, said, "I fully agree with your comments on the lack of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any fossil or living, I would certainly have included them, and I'll lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil of intermediate forms, or I would know about it." The sudden appearance of organisms in the fossil record and the non-availability of transitional forms tend to point much more strongly to a cataclysmic event, not the evolutionary slow process. This is a picture of Mary Schweitzer, who isolated living material from apparently fossilized dinosaurs. And this will created a lot of disquiet in the scientific and paleontology community, because it was pointing to the fairly recent events of the fossil record, and also the preservation of living material, which is supposed to have been ossified. She drew a lot of criticism, but her findings are irrefutable. In the words of Richard Lewontin, an evolutionist, we take the side of science in spite of patent absurdity of some of its constructs. Moreover, that materialism is absolute. Because we cannot allow a divine foot in the door, demonstrates an a priori bias against creationism, because he doesn't want to have a God to whom he has to be answerable. The last slides are about the concept of irreducible complexity. Here we have a biochemical machine which has a function that appears to be favored by natural selection according to evolutionists. It's a complex molecule, let's say, that can take sugar and make it into something useful. It has lots of individual parts. Each individual part is vital to the functioning of the machine, much like the cars you drive or the body you live in. If each of the individual parts are on their own, none of them have a function that's useful. But therefore, natural selection can't shape the components of a complex molecule because the components are useless. They have no function. And here you can see irreducible complexity complained to be a natural process by evolutionists by saying, look, there are all sorts of secretion systems in a flagellum which are inside a cell, and they use similar parts, and therefore they must have all come from the same type of accident. The problem with this is that a complex material like a complex construction like a flagellum in a bacteria that enables it to move has certain parts that it simply cannot do without. And the fact that some of its parts are used in other little machines do not lend credibility to it having formed spontaneously. You still require a mechanism to get these parts, and all of them must be present before the bacteria can move at all. And each separate component provides a different task for another machine, but nevertheless, on its own, is useless. Their conclusion that no designer is needed is a far-fetched conclusion and is nonsensical. I'll go back to the DNA replication. DNA contains a code which attracts amino acids to form a protein that will have a function. Let's take that protein DNA polymerase right in the middle of the screen. That is a powerful example of the zip code of the DNA has to be read by its product. And that is impossible philosophically, practically, or scientific. Even more so if we look at a very complex molecule like this. There are 48 subunits, 6 different functions. All of them have to have intertwining parts assembled in sequence. Every one of them require a perfect pH, salt concentration, and temperature. They all need to be wrapped within the same membrane. They have to require attendant enzymes to transport protons to them. All of them need the same type of fuel to start. They're all useless if the other enzymes in the entire chain that are presenting them, the pyruvate, if they weren't there. They're all useless if the product of this enzyme, which ultimately is ATP, hasn't been made already. So there are thousands of complexes like this in the little mitochondria on their own, and they all create energy to sustain the cell's life. It cannot function without all its parts, all in place, instantly. It's like electricity is required to make electricity. And the complexity of one cell shows how silly the theory of evolution actually is. All of these components are needed for a cell to work, and if a part of the cell didn't work, it would die. So how our evolutionists have to postulate is which part came first and which part was most important. The part itself would have absolutely no use at all if the other parts were not there to make it useful. So, is irreducible complexity compelling evidence for intelligent design and therefore creation? Well, there certainly now is a growing dissent among researchers in this field, and it should open the debate and argument about the origin of the complexity of life. And science might actually lead us where we don't want to go. The balance of probabilities is used in the courts of justice and should be used in the court of scientific argument too. What is more probable, a designed universe or one that is likely to have occurred with the same degree of probability as hitting a single atom at the other side of the Milky Way with an arrow shot blindly? So what's at stake? Well, quite honestly, if we're going to take any credibility as scientists, we then have to lead where science leads us. And the truth will come out eventually. You can see here that there is a list of dissenting Darwinists, even in Evolution News and Science Today, who are questioning the origin of the theory of evolution. And here we finish with a couple of biblical quotes. The Bible says that men are without excuse. Even those who are given no good reason to believe and many persuasive reasons to disbelieve, they have no excuse. Because the ultimate reason they don't believe is because they've deliberately rejected God's Holy Spirit. Jesus, who is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature, for by him all things were created, those things in heaven and that in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created by him and for him. And he is before all things, and by him all things consist. That's the narrative that the Christian faith puts up in opposition to the nonsensical observations of humankind through evolutionary theory. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even God's eternal power and Godhead, so they are without excuse. Thank you.
I'll take over.
I'm really happy to interact with folk if they have queries and questions. Please send us a note to the No Apologies link, and we'd love to hear your observations on the presentation. And to our best ability, we'll answer the questions that you may have and perhaps direct you to some very good resources. I hope you've enjoyed this, and we'll log out now.
Oh, so well, hang on. We'll just stay there for a second so that we can get back to this. So now we're actually back. Yeah. So what we might do is show this.
We have a question or an observation from my car. Many choose to side with what they think is scientific proof rather than be numbered among those like perhaps ourselves who are regarded as having ignorant faith. I hope by this presentation you've been able to at least see that by no means are we ignorant of scientific method, scientific observations, and scientific process. In fact, for the vast part of human history, science has in fact been in step with the acceptance that God has made the universe and has privileged us to be able to see it and think his thoughts after him. Thank you once again, everybody, for listening, and we look forward to our next session on STAN 2020, and we'll be sending you a link to where we go to from here. Goodbye now.